I'm currently doing a road trip through Vietnam. And I love doing road trips like this because sometimes you come across super interesting things that you wouldn't see otherwise. For example, a few days ago, I saw this in a town in the center of the country. Apparently, there is one well in this town, and the people of the town mounted a lot of pumps onto it, so they have running water at home. I find that super interesting, and you don't come across things like that if you do standard organized tours. Having said that, last week I spent a few days in Dalat, which is in the southern highlands of Vietnam. And there I did do one of these standard touristy tours. There was one interesting stop, which was a visit at a silk factory, where they use a relatively modern machine to unravel cocoons into silk threads. And that got me quite interested in silk production. So I looked a bit into it and I went to a few more silk related places in Vietnam. So this video is a short overview of what I've seen and learned. So first we're going to briefly talk about the silk production process in general, and then we'll try to figure out how this machine works, which I think is a super fun thing to do. So it all starts with a silk moth laying some eggs. Now, it doesn't have to be a silk moth. There are different animals that produce silk, but the vast majority of all silk that's produced commercially for textiles comes from a specific kind of moth. And that animal was domesticated literally thousands of years ago, and there has been selective breeding since. Originally, its cocoon was yellowish, but through the selective breeding process, it has become white, which makes it easier to dye, to color it. It's also larger, grows faster, and has certain other traits that are desirable for silk production. Another effect is that the moth can't fly anymore. So to reproduce, to create eggs, the male and female moths have to be placed next to each other by humans. So the silkworm has been domesticated to such a level that it wouldn't be able to survive on its own. What I've just said refers to the main species of silkworm that's used for creating textiles. There are also others that are used mostly for other purposes, like cosmetics, and their cocoons are not necessarily white. For example, here are a few yellow ones. Okay, so once a moth lays eggs, it takes about 2 weeks for the larvae to hatch. And those larvae have a rather limited diet, in that they very much prefer the leaves of the mulberry tree. This is what the tree looks like when it's small, but they do grow very quickly, so they can be harvested multiple times every year. Initially, the small larvae are fed with leaves that are cut to a small size, because that makes it easier for the larvae to eat them. As they grow, the leaves are cut into larger pieces, and at some point they don't have to be cut at all. After about 24 days, the larvae stop eating and they turn from this brighter color to a darker one. And that means that they're ready to pupate. So once they're ready, they look for a sturdy, safe place and they start spinning their cocoon. In silk production, they are placed on wooden frames like these. The silk that they create is made up of proteins that they consumed when eating the mulberry leaves. So they take this liquid protein shake that's within them and use their salivary glands to turn it into a thread. This is one long string, roughly 300 meters to 900 meters long, and it's very thin. Its diameter is about 13 micrometers, which is roughly a fifth of human hair. To produce the cocoon, the silkworm moves its body around in a certain pattern, and after about 2 to 3 days, the cocoon is ready, and the larvae start transforming into moths. If they manage to complete this transformation, then they will eventually break out of the cocoon. And in silk production, that happens for some of the cocoons in order to have new moths that can reproduce and create the next generation of silkworms. But as they break out of the cocoon, they also break the single long silk thread into many smaller pieces, which makes them less suitable for silk production. So the vast majority of silkworms never actually gets to a point where they turn into a moth. They are killed before that happens by exposing them to heat, traditionally to intense sunlight, or alternatively by putting them into a machine that uses hot air. And at this point, we've got a cocoon that's ready to be unraveled. First, the cocoons are put into hot water. At one of the places I've been to, they told me that they briefly boil them before reducing the temperature to about 70 degrees. This hot water makes the cocoons easier to unravel. And that's because the cocoon is made up of two proteins, fibrin and sericin. Fibrin gives silk its structure, and sericin is sticky and binds the fibrin strands together. And the hot water softens the cocoons and partially removes the sticky sericin. And that makes it easier to pull the threads apart. Traditionally, they would use a process like this, where the thread of each cocoon is manually fed through this hole and along the existing threads. At this point, the silk threads are still a bit sticky, so the threads from multiple cocoons can be combined into one thicker thread quite easily. If you want a thick thread, then you combine many cocoons, like here. For a really fine thread, you only combine maybe as few as 3 to 5 of them. At this point, the silk is still wet, so it has to be dried before it's processed further. Traditionally, they would hang them up and leave them for a while until they are dry. Now let's look at the machine I mentioned earlier. This is definitely not the most modern silk reeling machine that you can find, but I don't think it matters. It's still super interesting to see how it works. I've done my best to figure out the process, but I didn't get everything. So if you know something that I missed, then please share it in the comments. So just like in the manual process, the cocoons are first heated, and then they're transferred to the next stage with this piece of metal that goes up and down. We'll see another one like this again later. There's one thing that I didn't mention earlier, and that's that the outside of the cocoons is quite loose and there may be broken fibers. So in this first step that we're going to look at now, the machine will remove those rougher fibers. Okay, so these brushes gently grab onto the sticky silk threads on the outside of the cocoon, which moves the cocoons along and allows the machine to get hold of the threads. Next, there are these metal teeth, and I think their job is to make sure that the silk threads detach from the brushes. The threads are then twisted so they are not as loose anymore. The next interesting part is about how the cocoons move along this part of the machine. You can see that pretty much all of the cocoons in here have their silk thread go up into the rotating part on the left. They are then pushed further to the right as new cocoons get added from the previous step on the left. It happens a bit slowly here, so it's not so easy to see. But as they move to the right, this rotating blade in the middle picks up the threads of the cocoons and connects them to the outside of the thick thread in the middle. And that probably breaks the connection of these threads to the left rotating part. But since they're now connected to the thick thread, they are pulled along with it towards the screw on the right, which picks up the threads and moves them along towards the front of this part of the machine. Now at this point, the rougher thread is wound on a reel. This is a lower quality silk, which according to my guide is used locally in some way, but he wasn't specific about it. But the good stuff is made from the cocoons that are now free from the outer part of their cocoon. So this was the first part of the machine, the deflossing part. The next part is about reeling the cocoons, so unraveling them and creating a silk thread. For that, the cocoons are put into smaller trays. I assume that makes it easier to put individual cocoons into the right place. As they move down to the blue trays, they are still connected to the thick thread from before, and this metal wire here is responsible for cutting them. So the cocoons in the tray now have a long piece of loose silk that's just hanging off them. The trays now continue on to the place where the cocoons are unraveled. And this machine creates many threads at once. So a thread is created at each of these positions. And at each position, based on my counting, 9 cocoons are unraveled. So this is finer than in the manual process we saw earlier, but still not as fine as it gets. If a cocoon has been used up, then a new one is added. And that happens if this metal bar moves down and activates this mechanical switch. Once the switch is activated, a cocoon is thrown out of the tray. And I think as this metal bar moves back up, it catches the loose part of the silk that's hanging off the cocoon, and it moves it up towards the blades that rotate up there. And the blades probably wrap it around the existing threads, and I think since they are sticky, they connect and just stay together. So the combined thread goes through this hole here, which is the same kind of hole as we saw in the traditional method before. Then the thread goes through a set of wheels that redirect it a few times. I'm not sure why that's happening. I can imagine that this back and forth may help the thread to bind together better. One of the wheels and this little arm next to it move occasionally. Unfortunately, I didn't look at that carefully when I was there, and I can't figure out what exactly is happening based on my recordings. Maybe that happens when a new cocoon is added to help it join the existing thread in some way, but I'm really not sure about that. I also couldn't figure out how the machine knows that a new cocoon should be added. Okay, so the resulting thread is then wound on a reel, and now we've got a reel of silk. There is also another machine right next to this one. At the bottom of the machine, you put the reels that were created earlier. And then they're unwound. The thread passes through this eye here, and then it rubs against this kind of hair. I think the purpose of this is to clean it, to get rid of some of the sticky sericin that may still be on the thread. Then the thread is wound up onto another reel. Inside it's actually quite warm, so this step is probably also intended to dry the silk. And that's all they were doing, or at least showing to us in this factory. There are still more steps in the silk production process. For example, right now the silk threads are not very strong yet, so a next step would be to combine multiple threads and twist them into a yarn. Then the silk would probably be dyed and so on. There was one more interesting thing to see in this factory. You can see there's this lady going through the cocoons that have been almost completely unraveled. And what she's doing is to remove the silkworms from the remainder of the cocoon, because they keep them and use them as food. So at the exit of the factory, you could try some fried silkworms with some spices on them. And my guide said that they also use them in stir fries. So it's nice to see that they're not wasted. Okay, that was all I wanted to say about silk production. Please let me know in the comments if you like this kind of video. And if you've made it this far, then please give the video a like, and you're welcome to subscribe. I've certainly enjoyed making this video. You know, traveling and making interesting videos about what you see is a little dream of mine. So, thanks for watching, and see you soon.